I've always looked up to Pastor Ryan.
He was the kind of man who could command a room, speak words that reached into your soul, and make you feel like you were the only person in the world that mattered. From the very first day I walked into that small, modest church, I knew there was something different about him. He had a way of making people feel safe, understood, even when life seemed like it was falling apart. I never thought much about my relationship with him, at least, not until a few months ago. It started with small gestures, things I didn't recognize for what they were at the time. A lingering glance during a Sunday service, an extra second of eye contact that made my heart race when it shouldn't have. I brushed it off, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. Pastor Ryan was married. His wife, Sarah, was lovely. They seemed like the perfect couple, always smiling together in public. Yet there was something beneath the surface that didn't add up. I'd hear whispers now and then, members of the congregation exchanging hushed comments about their marriage being strained. But I told myself it was none of my business. I was deeply involved in the church's activities, youth group meetings, choir practices, charity events, you name it, I was there. The church had become my second home, and Pastor Ryan had become someone I trusted deeply, maybe too deeply. It was after one of the midweek Bible study sessions when things took a turn. Most people had left the building, the dim lights creating a peaceful calm in the otherwise bustling church. I was organizing some papers at the front when Pastor Ryan approached me. "You did a great job today," he said, his voice soft, his presence suddenly closer than I expected. "Thank you, Pastor. I enjoy being a part of everything," I replied, trying to ignore the butterflies in my stomach. "Everyone does, but you," he paused, his eyes locking onto mine. "You have a unique energy. There's something about you that stands out." I didn't know what to say. Was this a compliment? Or was there more behind his words than I wanted to believe? Before I could respond, he placed a hand on my shoulder. It wasn't inappropriate, not yet, but there was an intensity in the touch that made my pulse quicken. "You're special, you know that. I don't think you realize just how much of an impact you have on this place." I smiled awkwardly, trying to maintain a polite distance. "I'm just happy to help." His hand lingered for a moment too long before he pulled it away. "You're not just helping, you're making this church better. I can't imagine it without you." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded, with a meaning I couldn't quite decipher. Pastor Ryan's gaze felt too intimate, too personal, but I couldn't say anything. He was my pastor, how could I? He didn't say anything more that night, but I left the church feeling strange, conflicted. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into his words? I tried to push it out of my mind, but the feeling stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts like an unsolved mystery. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the encounter over and over. What was he trying to tell me? Was it simply admiration for my commitment to the church, or something else entirely? My heart raced, not with excitement, but with confusion. What was happening between us? The days after that encounter were filled with tension, at least for me. I avoided being alone with Pastor Ryan as much as possible, though it wasn't always easy. I told myself I was overreacting, that his words were just that, words, but deep down, something had changed. A week later, after another Bible study session, I found myself in the church again, helping clean up. Most of the other volunteers had already left, except for a few lingering members chatting near the entrance. As I packed away hymnals, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart sank. I didn't have to turn around to know it was him. "Hey!" Pastor Ryan's voice broke the silence, soft but heavy with familiarity. I turned, plastering a smile on my face, trying to act normal. "Hi, Pastor, just finishing up here." He leaned against one of the pews, his eyes studying me. "You don't have to stay so late, you know, but I appreciate that you do." "I don't mind," I replied, though it was a lie. In that moment, I wanted nothing more than to leave, to be anywhere but standing alone with him, in the stillness of the church. He nodded but didn't move. "It's nice to have someone so dedicated," he said after a pause. "Sometimes I feel like I can talk to you, in ways I can't with others." There was again that strange, almost personal tone. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I wasn't sure how to respond. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said cautiously, trying to keep my words neutral. He took a step closer, and I instinctively stepped back, my hands tightening around the hymnals I was holding. His face softened, noticing my reaction. "You don't have to be nervous around me," he said, his voice gentle. "I've been thinking, I see something in you, something I don't see in many people." I didn't know what he meant by that. His words felt too personal, too intimate for a conversation between a pastor and a member of his congregation. My mind raced, trying to find a way to change the subject, to steer the conversation back to safe territory. "I'm just happy to be a part of the church," I repeated, forcing another smile, hoping it would diffuse the situation. He smiled too, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're not like the others," he continued, his tone shifting slightly. "There's a connection between us, something I think we both feel." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Was I imagining this? Was I overanalyzing his words? Or was there something undeniably off about the way he was speaking to me? "I think you're misunderstanding something, Pastor," I finally said, my voice trembling slightly. "I respect you as my pastor and I appreciate your guidance, but I think we need to keep things professional." There, I had said it. My hands were shaking as I waited for his response, unsure if I had crossed a line by speaking up. Would he be offended? Would he back off? Pastor Ryan's face didn't change. If anything, his expression softened even more, like he was trying to reassure me. "I understand," he said, though his eyes said something different. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." But despite his words, the tension didn't leave the air. I quickly gathered my things, my movements hurried and clumsy. "I should go," I said abruptly, avoiding eye contact as I headed for the door. "It's getting late." I didn't wait for his response as I slipped out of the church. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped outside, but it did little to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me. What had just happened? On the walk home, I replayed the conversation over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it. There was a boundary between us, one that should never have been crossed. And yet, it felt like that boundary had started to blur, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably. I spent the next few days avoiding any situation where I might be alone with Pastor Ryan. I stuck to group settings, kept conversations brief, and tried to maintain my distance. But no matter how much I avoided him, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was looming, something that could tip over the edge at any moment. And then, just when I thought things might settle back to normal, I got a message from him. It was a simple text, one that shouldn't have meant anything but sent a chill down my spine.
"Can we talk?"
"Alone?" The message sat there, glaring at me from my phone screen. I stared at it, my heart pounding.
"Can we talk? Alone?"
Simple words, but they held so much weight. My first instinct was to ignore it, pretend I hadn't seen it. But a part of me was curious. What could Pastor Ryan possibly want to talk about alone? After a few minutes of internal debate, I replied with a short, "Sure."
"When?"
His response was quick. "After Sunday service, the back office." A lump formed in my throat. It felt wrong, and yet I couldn't bring myself to say no. Maybe he just wanted to clear the air, to explain that I had misunderstood his intentions. I hoped for that. I needed to believe that my mind was playing tricks on me, that there was nothing inappropriate happening here. Sunday came, and I tried to focus on the service, but it was impossible. My thoughts were consumed by the looming conversation. Pastor Ryan delivered his sermon with his usual confidence, but every time our eyes met, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Was he thinking about our conversation too? Was this as complicated for him as it was for me? When the service ended, I lingered, watching as people slowly trickled out of the church. My feet felt heavy, every step toward the back office weighed down by doubt. I considered turning around, making an excuse to leave, but I couldn't. I had to face this. I knocked lightly on the office door, and his voice called out, "Come in." Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The room was small and simple, filled with bookshelves and religious artifacts. Pastor Ryan stood by the window, his back to me. The air in the room felt thick, almost stifling. "You wanted to talk, Pastor?" I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. He turned around slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yes, thank you for coming." He motioned for me to sit, but I stayed standing, unsure of how close I wanted to be. I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation, he started, his voice calm, but laced with something deeper. And I need you to know that I never intended to make you uncomfortable. I nodded, but stayed silent. I wanted him to keep talking, to explain himself. I value you, he continued, not just as a member of this church, but as someone I've come to admire. My pulse quickened. There it was again. Admire. That word felt too personal, too intimate. I've been struggling with something, he admitted, his eyes meeting mine. Something I haven't been able to share with anyone, not even Sarah. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to be as confident, the one he confided in about whatever this was. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. Sometimes, he said slowly, I feel like I'm trapped in a role, an image of what a pastor should be. People look up to me, and I'm expected to be perfect, to have all the answers. But I'm just a man. And lately I felt lost. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. This was getting too personal, too emotional. But I couldn't interrupt. I didn't know how. I found myself drawn to you, he said, his voice lowering, almost as if he were confessing a sin. Not in a way that's wrong, but in a way that's confusing. I've tried to understand it, tried to push it away, but I can't. My heart stopped. This was the conversation I had been dreading, the moment I had hoped wouldn't come. I need to be honest with you, he continued. There's a connection between us, something deeper than just pastor and congregation. I don't want to act on it.
I know that's not right.
But I can't deny that it's there. The room felt like it was closing in on me. The air grew heavier, and I could barely breathe.
I didn't know what to say.
My mind raced with a million thoughts, all jumbled together. This was wrong. This was so wrong. Pastor, I started, but he interrupted me. I'm not asking you to do anything, he said quickly, as if reading my mind. I just needed to say it out loud, to acknowledge it. I don't want to burden you with this, but I couldn't keep pretending that I don't feel something. I stood there, frozen, as his words hung in the air. What was I supposed to do with this? He had just admitted something that crossed every line, something that would shatter the trust between us forever. I don't know what to say, I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his tone softening. I just needed you to know that I'm struggling, but I won't let it affect my role here. I respect you too much for that. Respect? How could he say that now, after what he'd just told me? I need time to process this, I said, stepping back toward the door. I think it's best if we don't talk like this again. He didn't try to stop me, he just nodded, his eyes sad but resigned. I understand. I left the office, my mind spinning. The world outside felt different, like it had shifted on its axis. I didn't know what had just happened. All I knew was that the relationship I once trusted was now tainted, and there was no going back. After that conversation, everything changed. I stopped attending church for a while, telling myself it was to clear my head, to distance myself from the situation. But the truth was, I felt like I couldn't face Pastor Ryan anymore, not after what he had confessed. I avoided his calls, ignored his texts, and tried to live my life as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't that easy. His words, the weight of his admission, haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was complicit somehow, that by not saying anything, by not calling out what had happened, I had allowed it to fester. I felt a mix of anger and guilt, unsure of who to blame. Weeks passed, and I finally returned to the church, hoping that time had cooled the tension. But the moment I stepped inside, I could feel the shift. People glanced at me with curious eyes. Whispers followed me like shadows. Had he told someone? Was there more to the story than I knew? Pastor Ryan was different too. His sermons were still powerful, still commanding, but there was a tension in his posture, a discomfort that hadn't been there before. He didn't look at me directly anymore, but I could feel his presence every time we were in the same room. The invisible connection he had spoken of hung in the air between us, like an unspoken secret. One Sunday after the service, Sarah, Pastor Ryan's wife, approached me. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
Can we talk?
She asked, her voice pleasant but firm. Just for a moment. My stomach flipped. I nodded, following her to a quieter corner of the church. Her expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, something that told me she knew more than I realized. "I've noticed you've been distant," she started, her words slow, deliberate. "From the church, from Ryan, from everything, I wanted to check on you." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. "I've just been busy with work," I lied, though I knew it wasn't convincing. Sarah smiled again, but this time there was a sadness in it. "You know, Ryan talks about you a lot," she said, her voice quiet but sharp. "He says you're special, that you've made a difference in this church." The air between us thickened, and I suddenly felt like I couldn't breathe. What was she trying to say? Did she know? Had he confessed to her too? "I'm not sure what you mean," I replied, my voice barely steady. "I think you do," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Look, I don't know what's been going on between you two, but I need you to understand something. Ryan is a good man, but he's not perfect. He makes mistakes, just like everyone else." I blinked, unsure of how to respond. Was she blaming me? Did she think I had something to do with what had happened? "I didn't do anything," I said quickly, defensively. "I didn't." "I'm not accusing you," Sarah interrupted, her tone soft but firm. "But I'm asking you, woman to woman, to be careful. This church means everything to Ryan, and he's under a lot of pressure. Sometimes people make connections that they shouldn't, and it can lead to confusion, hurt, things that can't be taken back." Her words stung, but I understood what she was saying. She wasn't angry at me. She was warning me. She was trying to protect something, even if it meant ignoring the truth. "I just want to move on," I whispered, my voice small, the weight of everything crashing down on me. "I never meant for this to happen." Sarah reached out and gently touched my arm, her expression softening. "Neither did he," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But some things can't be undone. We just have to make sure they don't go any further." I nodded, tears burning the back of my eyes. I felt trapped, like there was no way out of this without causing more damage. Sarah gave me a final look, something between empathy and resignation, before walking away, leaving me standing there with the weight of her words. From that moment, I knew I had to make a choice. I could stay silent, continue pretending that nothing had happened, or I could step away, completely. I chose the latter. I stopped attending church altogether. I didn't explain myself to anyone, not even to Pastor Ryan. The distance felt like a relief, like I could finally breathe again. But it also left a hollow space in my heart where my faith used to be. I had trusted Pastor Ryan, admired him, and that trust had been shattered, not because of anything physical, but because of the emotional lines that had been crossed, the boundaries that had blurred. Months later, I heard that Pastor Ryan had stepped down from his position. No one said why, but the whispers in the congregation hinted at marital issues, stress, and a growing disconnect between him and the church. I never saw Sarah again, and I never went back to that church, but the experience stayed with me. It changed how I viewed trust, authority, and the subtle ways relationships can shift into dangerous territory. It taught me that silence is sometimes the most harmful choice, and that boundaries, once crossed, can leave lasting scars.